Hello everyone, Tom with Capo Fetish. Today on the channel, I'm going to talk about some stellar standalone single flops. These are singles that were released that barely charted, later appearing on compilation albums. And I'm going to pay homage to these tracks. I think some of these tracks are just absolutely phenomenal, but they didn't really get their due. So I'm going to start off here with a track from 1980. It was initially featured in a film called Roadie, a real B movie that starred Meatloaf. Along with this particular artist, there were other songs on there by Pat Benatar and Susat and the Next and other various artists. But this particular track stood out to me the first time I saw this B movie. It was featured in the opening credits, and I didn't even know who it was. I had no idea it was this particular band. It's such a kick-ass track, and from my opinion, I think it's one of the greatest tracks this band has ever released, if not the greatest. It only peaked at 44. It got a little bit of airplay in the beginning of the summer of 1980 and just kind of disappeared. Never heard the song again. I'm talking about Cheap Trick's song, Everything Works If You Let It. Incredible track if you've never heard this. I'm sure any Cheap Trick fan knows how great this track is. But if you're just kind of a mediocre Cheap Trick fan, or just a kind of not even a fan at all, I highly suggest you pull this track up. First of all, this particular version too is different than the one that was on Roadie. This particular version starts off with this acoustic guitar with Robin Zander playing it, and then it stops, and then it just kicks into full gear with this really infectious guitar lick from Rick Nielsen, and probably one of the greatest vocals ever put down on tape by Robin Zander. It is so incredible. Hook-filled, melodic, has this incredible middle eight that is just as great as the rest of the song. There is not a bad second of this track. It is unbelievable. For anybody who is a fan of power pop or just hard-hitting music or just, you know, rock and roll in general, you would love this track. It has everything you want in it. It was produced by George Martin. And inexplicably, you just never hear it on the radio or on satellite radio or any kind of radio. But I think they realized how great it was to put it on this particular greatest hits album here. So I highly suggest, if you've never heard this song, Everything Works If You Let It by Cheap Trick, check it out. It'll blow your mind how good it is. On first listen, I guarantee you, you'll be like, wow, that is an amazing track. So that's starting off today's video today. Cheap Trick's Everything Works If You Let It, initially released on the Roadie soundtrack. I had that soundtrack at one time and purged it, and I do regret it because it was a track by Susat and the Next doing a version of Music Machine's Double Yellow Line. So yeah, I purged it and I regret it. So anyway, that's number one for the day. Another really great flop was from 1967 from the Byrds. It's a track called Lady Friend, written by David Crosby. The song was released between the albums Younger Than Yesterday and the Notorious Byrd Brothers. Highly produced for a Byrd single around this period. This is one of David Crosby's best compositions. It's just really, really melodic and infectious. I think he does most of the harmonies on this particular track. I think he pretty much decided to take control of the production duties on this track. There's an orchestral section that starts off the song, and there's a little mid-section too with a lot of orchestral backing. But they played this song at the Monterey Pop Festival. They did a pretty good version of it too, without all the backing and everything, all the orchestral overdubs. But if you've never heard this track, if you're not a Byrds fan, check it out. It's really, really cool. Of course, it was later released on this Odds and Sods compilation called Never Before from the 1980s. And then it was later released as bonus track on the Notorious Byrd Brothers CD back in 97. The flip side of Lady Friend is a track called Old John Robertson, which would later appear on the Notorious Byrd Brothers album. Right here is the single edit on this, along with Lady Friend. So Lady Friend, one of the great flop Byrd singles from 1967. Another single that was really huge in Britain in 1966 was the flip, well, not the flip, it was the follow-up single to Sunny Afternoon. I'm talking about the Kinks. The track is called Dead End Street. It was a number 5 hit in the UK, only reached about 73 here in the US, and this was about the time that the Kinks' popularity in the US was starting to wane because of their ban from the US. Ironically, they were starting to write some of their greatest material around this time. You've got albums like Face to Face, Something Else, Village Green, Arthur, all British-based albums, but had a hardcore following here in the US. So this song here, very, very, very not very 1966. It's a song talking about poverty. But as always, the Kinks are always kind of out of time and ahead of their time at the same time, especially during this period. They're doing things that are totally anti-hip. They're doing things that are totally British, have nothing to do with America at this point, probably as a result from that ban from the US, but they're cranking out some of their greatest material at this point. Dead End Street is one of their fantastic singles from the mid-60s. And on the flip side is a song called Big Black Smoke, which was initially planned for the Face to Face album, but was omitted from that album. You know, maybe if they had taken out maybe Party Line and threw in Big Black Smoke, Face to Face would have been even more stellar. So again, Dead End Street only hit like 73 here in the US, one of the greatest mid-60s Kinks songs, a complete flop here in the US, huge single in the UK. By the way, this whole video is about chart placings in the US, whereas some of these songs may have gone higher in other areas in the world. So Kinks, Dead End Street, great flop here in the US. And then the first time I ever heard it here was on the Kink Controversy album, released in '72. The Clash, the first single they released in the US was a cover of the Bobby Fuller Four's I Fought the Law from 1966, which was a huge hit here in the US. Here in the US, the first time we heard it was on this bastardized version of the first Clash album, where they added a couple of cool singles like Complete Control and Clash City Rockers. But I still like the UK version of this album because it's more authentic. It's the real deal. But here, I Fought the Law is featured. It never charted. The song never charted here in the US. But over time, it got a lot of airplay on alternative stations and was featured in several movies, video games, and such. But another example of a flop single that is outstanding, and I think one of the best cover versions of a song from the 60s. I Fought the Law by The Clash. How about the very last single by Cream, which is really, really different sounding for Cream. It's kind of whimsical. It's kind of folky sounding. It has kind of like this it has this vibe that is unlike any other Cream song. I'm talking about the song Anyone for Tennis. All right, this is the last single released in the U.S. I think it only got to about 64 on the charts. Okay, the flip side was Press Rat and Warthog from Wheels of Fire. Anyone for Tennis was recorded during the Wheels of Fire sessions, but for some reason they never released it on the album. It would have sounded weird on that album, with all the jams on side 3 and 4 and all the rock on side 1 and 2. But it's written by Eric Clapton. It was written for a film called The Savage Seven. It was this biker exploitation film. I don't think the film was a real hit. But this song only reached 64. It's a flop. I love this track. It doesn't really sound like anything Cream did. And this came out in 1969, right before they split. It wasn't even released on the Goodbye Cream album. I love it. It's fantastic. Another flop. It never went anywhere. One of my favorite Stones songs is probably one of their worst charting songs in the US, and it was released as the A-side in Britain, and I think it was a top 10 hit there. But here it was the flip side of Dandelion. I'm talking about the song We Love You. It only hit number 50 here on the charts, but I've always thought this song was very forward-thinking. It has this really infectious piano part played by Nicky Hopkins. We've got some really cool mellotron played by Brian Jones. Yeah, it just has this kind of hypnotic vibe, and I'm the first to admit I think a lot of the Stones psychedelic stuff is kind of subpar. There are some great tracks like 2,000 Light Years from Home and maybe The Lantern, but I think this is one of the best examples of the Stones doing psychedelic. It almost kind of has this kind of pre-rave vibe to it. And I think it's just fantastic. It's a flop. It was never featured on any of their albums. It was recorded during their Satanic Majesty's Request sessions, but never really did much here in the U.S. And I think it's one of their greatest unsung, shall we say, singles. from the 60s. We Love You from the Stones only hit number 50. First time it was heard was on the More Hot Rocks album here in the US. Another great one here too is the Last Faces single. At this point, they were just known as Rod Stewart and the Faces because of his increasing popularity, starting with Maggie May and the Every Picture Tells a Story album and Never a Dull Moment. So, I mean, the Faces days are waning at this point, but I really love this track. It was never featured on any Faces album until the Snakes and Ladders compilation in 1976. Now, the song is called You Can Make Me Dance, Sing, or Anything, but it actually has a longer title. Now, I have to put the flashlight on this title because the printing is so small. So here's the full title of this song. It's called You Can Make Me Dance, Sing, or Anything, Even Take the Dog for a Walk, Mend a Fuse, Fold Away the Ironing Board, or Any Other Domestic Shortcomings. That has to be one of the longest single titles of all time. So this particular track here by the Faces was never featured on any studio album. And it's really notable because it has this kind of funky dance beat and almost kind of, you can almost see where Rod Stewart's going at this point from here on in. But I dig it. It has a really cool guitar part by Ronnie Wood. The flip side, too, is never featured on any Faces album. It's this ballad called As Long As You Tell Him, which is really cool. Of course, this is on the Warner Brothers label, so I'm throwing this in the mix, too. I think this is a great track. A real flop, but never really has had any praise. So I'm giving it praise today on the channel. The Faces, You Can Make Me Dance, Sing, or Anything from 1975. A song I've featured a few times here on the channel. I'm going to feature it again because it fits in with this subject matter. Is the follow-up single to Procol Harum's A Whiter Shade of Pale. It only reached about number 34 here on the charts and just dropped right off. And I think it's almost nearly as good. The song is called Hamburg. And the only real difference in the song, the vibe is kind of similar to A Whiter Shade of Pale, but the only real difference is that this is more piano-driven, not Hammond B3 organ-driven. Of course, featuring another stellar vocal performance by Gary Brooker. First time I heard it, or first time it was released, was on this compilation in the US called The Best of Procol Harum. Hamburg, fantastic track. Another one, too, I have featured in other videos, but I must because I love this track. It was a standalone flop by Jefferson Airplane, released between the albums Volunteers and Bark in 1970. The track is called Mexico, featuring another stellar performance, vocal performance by Grace Slick. It kind of follows the format of songs like Happiness is a Warm Gun by the Beatles, where nothing is repeated. The song just starts off and goes into different parts and never repeats. It's under 3 minutes long, and it is fantastic. The flip side is a Paul Kantner song called Have You Seen the Saucers? And this was never released on any compilation. This wasn't even released on the Worst of the Jefferson Airplane compilation, their first compilation in the US. First time I heard this track was on their double compilation in 1987 called 2400 Fulton Street. And that's how I became to love the track. Mexico by Jefferson Airplane from 1970, another great standalone flop. And last on the list, ladies and gentlemen, is a track by Genesis from the Peter Gabriel era. This is a track that was a standalone track, never released on any of their albums. It was a flop, never charted anywhere. First time I ever heard it was on this compilation called Genesis Archive 67 through 75. The song is called Happy the Man. It's this like kind of really unusual track for this period in Genesis. It's kind of folky. It's under 3 minutes long. It's not real epic, kind of whimsical sounding. And I love it. It's a fantastic little track. So I believe this is out of print, but if you're into the Peter Gabriel Genesis era, I highly suggest picking this up. There's 4 discs inside here. The first 2 discs is a complete performance of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway at the Shrine Auditorium in 1975. Of course, there were overdubs thrown into the mix for this release because some of Gabriel's vocals were not coming out real clear because of the costumes, I suppose. And then the last track, It, was cut off during the taping, so they did a full-on reworking in the studio of the song It for this particular release. But it's still cool to listen to. You can hear the whole performance in its entirety of Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. The third disc on here are performances from the Rainbow Theater in '73, like from the Selling England by the Pound tour, them doing Supper's Ready, I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe. They throw a few single tracks in here. One it was a B-side called Twilight Alehouse. That was the B-side of, I think, it was either I Know What I Like or Watcher of the Skies. And then the song Happy the Man is on here as well in the disc 3. And disc 4 has a bunch of like first album Genesis tracks before the album from Genesis to Revelation came out. So don't really listen to track or CD4 that much. I don't really care for that period. But anyway, as I said, Happy the Man is a great standalone single that never went anywhere, a complete flop. I dig it. What can you add to the mix here? These are songs that are standalone flops, so are not featured on any single releases. And throw those in the comment section if you have any more to add. As always, I always appreciate you watching. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, just go ahead and press the subscribe button if you dig the channel, dig the content. It's free. Not a lot of things are free these days. And that is it for today, folks. We will see you soon. Take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye.